I'm so excited to welcome you to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Lauren Camp back with us for a second craft chat to celebrate her new book, In the Old Sky. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, and it's great to see everybody.
Right. Yeah, I'm really excited. It's been a couple years since we've had a chat like this, and a lot of books have come in those in-between years. Could you get us started with a couple poems from the latest collection?
Yeah, I'd love to. I've read from the book quite a bit, so I thought I would read some poems I haven't read to other audiences to begin.
Yay.
This poem is called Tiny Plot. Maybe needing to go deeper within, I made a vow to go out and linger. I waited for the people around me who loved the daylight, loved its cling, to head off before they were held to a tamarind residual. Looking, they couldn't see more than old swords. But it was then the truth set to find the size of an intrinsic pulse and various twisty ventricles for the wishes of wind. The sky pleasured from clouds to an ink of horizon, script and crossouts. One shape morphed to another. Did I stop trying to see? And if so, when? When, if I'm honest, did I know those inexact crevices, that pendulous, reversible space? When did I see it as sublime, that dark, dark, as low-shouldered blue Georgette? The earth tread below it. I remember meticulous detail I knew not to look to find. Instead, I savored the texture and structure of living in and out, where the air kept its sermon. I pulled on a sweatshirt. No one knew me. Hour on hour, I decided the sky wasn't stealing the light, but translating the heart from the usual. In the interior, ravens called back, and I eased into a thick rearranging. Before I read the second poem, which is really short, I will just say that all of the poems in the book were written about and during, or begun at least, during my time, a month I spent at the Grand Canyon, with the intention and the focus of looking not just into the canyon, but at the skies overhead. So this second poem that I'm going to read is really short, and the title goes straight into the poem. Tonight, the sky breathes wet sacks into riot. Thunder binds and returns like a bird cage opened. Let me begin again. I will see what will let me see. Night, washing the dishes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving us a taste of the poems in the book. And I love those two that you read. I think there's so much sonically happening, and so many of the themes and images that we'll hopefully get to talk about will be present in those poems too. All right. So as we get going, can you tell us a little bit about who you are as a poet, how you came to poetry, and maybe how this book came to be?
I am a resident of New Mexico. I live in a farming village a little south of Santa Fe. I am the poet laureate of the state. It's a 3-year term, and I'm just completing my second year. I came to poetry through a career as a visual artist, in which I was self-taught. And I would say I'm very much self-taught in poetry too. But at the time that I was making visual art, I was also volunteering at our public radio station, hosting and producing a music show primarily, where I kept slipping poems in a few times every hour and voicing them. And those two separate creative pursuits, the visual art and the sound work, both influenced and really taught me how to write a poem. So that's kind of how I came to poetry. I started writing things, I didn't know what they were, to accompany my visual art, and someone started to call them poems. And so I thought I better figure out what exactly a poem could be.
I love that. And I love the way that different arts are sort of influencing your work. I think this is something we talked about in the last chat too, but even with this new collection, right, there's almost a similar kind of interaction between something so visual, right, like the Grand Canyon or the sky, and then the way that you're able to transform it into something so poetic on the page too. All right, so we'll start with our kind of hardest question, or maybe the most tricky question, depending on how you look at it. But I'm wondering, because, we always talk about poets noticing things, right? We're noticing everything around us, and somehow that's sort of coming into our poetry. Is there something that you do within your work, or something that you notice within your own work that has never been brought up to you, or that you haven't gotten to discuss yet? Something maybe you haven't been asked about, but you do on maybe a conscious or unconscious level?
There's so many things that I do intuitively that I don't realize until somebody says, "Oh, I see you're doing this," or how do you, I don't know, how do you describe things that way? And I'm like, what does that way mean? That way is my way. Like, that's the way I think and see. But one question that I guess people haven't asked is, how does it feel to write a poem? How does it feel to me to write a poem? And, or maybe that's just what I want to talk about, because it's been a little while since I've had the chance to really settle in and write a poem, or write even a first draft of a poem. And I've been writing lots of emails and proposals and, all the stuff you do in a busy daily life. But I've occasionally described writing a poem as like a massage for my brain. And I think that's because poems, drafts of poems even, are where I come to the page without an agenda, and without a demand, and without a sense of this has to be right or perfect, or even honestly interesting for a while. It just has to be a little bit of something I want to hold on to or let go of onto the page. And so for me, there's a whole different feeling to writing a poem than almost anything else I do, writing or otherwise. It doesn't have it doesn't have to have a direction for me for a long time. It's just a place I get to sort of, I don't know, explore in a way.
Yeah, I love that framing a poem as a place of exploration. And I think we can often put so much pressure on the blank page, right? With, pressure to publish, pressure to have a perfect first draft, right? All these things that we can kind of get in our heads about, but keeping that openness, that expansiveness of the page is so important.
I have gotten to the point, maybe it's because I've written a lot now, I've gotten to the point where a perfect first draft as a concept doesn't sound even interesting to me. It sounds a little too, I don't know, formulaic or something, like something where I'm only taking out of my mind what I know right now. And I have learned that I really like to make my poems be multi-layered and complex. And I can't do that on a first writing.
Yeah, it makes me think too about that element of play or even surprise, right? Where when you're writing, sometimes the most enjoyable moments of that process are where we surprise ourselves, where we don't really know where we're going, and something kind of falls into place. Maybe an image comes and we're not sure what to do with it yet. And then later on it comes through too.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that. That's what I'm waiting for and hoping
Mm.
for.
So, since we're talking a little bit about writing process, and you mentioned the residency at the Grand Canyon Conservancy, could you talk a little bit about your time there and maybe how you navigated that sort of set aside creative time? And, maybe did you set goals for what you wanted to do while you were there? How do you kind of remain present in that moment and kind of absorb everything while also having this maybe project on the back end?
Haha, no goals. I had no goals. At least that was my intention, to have no goals. Um, so I had a month at the Grand Canyon. My title was Astronomer in Residence.
Mm.
So I had a giant historical hole in front of me, and I had basically an awesome responsibility to try to in some way express it, but I had nobody asking for anything, or so I thought when I got there. I was staying right above at the South Rim, right above the visitor center, in an apartment that has been there for a little more than 100 years, and actually now probably about 115 years. And I could see the canyon from my bed where
Mm.
I was staying. I could just look into it. What that time gave me was a chance to look again and again and again and again, to see the light or the darkness, or the canyon in many different light situations, and um, other weather situations. So I had no real goal. I had a couple of public programs I was going to do. But when I drove up, the Dark Skies Ranger met me and carried a couple of my boxes in. And he said, "Would you mind writing some dispatches? We're hoping you're going to write some dispatches for our social media." Okay, I just want to pause here and say, think about this. For Grand Canyon National Park social media, could I write some dispatches? And I said, well, what's a dispatch look like? What would that mean? And he said, it could be, a little of what you're doing here. It doesn't have to be a big deal. But I was there with this phenomenal title, not as an astronomer, but as a poet. And I was pretty self-conscious about that. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to write poems for this social media account. And I don't write poems very quickly. I
Mm.
start them, but as I said, I like for them to layer. So I like for them to take a long time. And I didn't have that kind of time, because when I asked when he wanted them, he said, well, it would be great if you had the first one in a few days. And uh, so then I suddenly had goals.
Mm.
That's kind of why I'm telling you that, because suddenly I had a responsibility to turn some things in. And honestly, thank heavens I had that, because otherwise it it was an enormous task to try to describe something so wonderful and extraordinary. And I could be talking either about the canyon or the skies, right?
Mm.
So it was good to be focused in to a deadline and a direction in a way. And the thing that the social media account did for me was it gave me an audience to speak to,
Mm.
in my poems, which I don't usually think about when I'm writing.
Yeah, that's interesting. The kind of framing of, I mean, I guess it's like genre, right? Social media is kind of like a genre. So you're thinking about all these different constraints that come with that and the ways that you can sort of push against those ideas with your own work too. Almost like its own form in some way too, that you're working with or against.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Oh, so just another question about the residency. Was the book project planned in part, or did it sort of come together afterwards?
It was not planned at all. I don't think in books, really.
Mm.
I do think in, the way I write is often repeatedly into whatever I'm working with, whatever situation or opportunity, good or bad, that is on my mind. So I'll write that a lot of times, and I certainly did that at the Grand Canyon, but I had no plan for a book. I had no plan for truly for anything. I was just going to pay attention as many hours of the day and night as I possibly could. And then after a while, I was there in August a few years ago. And after a while, I was like, okay, I don't have to pay attention during the day so much, because you can't pay attention all the time. And the nights and the mornings were more extraordinary. The light was more interesting, more things were happening, there were fewer people, the temperature was more tolerable. Like, there was a lot to say for those edges of the day. About, I don't know, halfway through or a little more, the residency manager met up with me and said, we want to have your books in the gift shop. And I said, that doesn't make much sense. By the time you get them, I will be gone. And the books have nothing to do with the Grand Canyon, and they have nothing to do with the skies and the darkness here. But meanwhile, I have been so inspired, and I've written so much, that if you want to think about that, we could maybe talk about a book you could make. I knew they had a publishing arm. I also proposed it very much like that. Like, it was an idea, like, from my mind out into the space where we were meeting. And when it came out, I was like, oh, I like that idea. And she did too. And little by little, we started to pull it together. So that's how it came about.
Wow, I love that. Because I was thinking, sometimes when you encounter residencies or even grants, right, there's a project idea that you apply with, right? And so there's some sort of idea of completion at the end. And I was thinking about the sort of pressure that can put on those kind of dedicated spaces and times. But it seems like you were given a lot of great freedom to just observe and create as you wanted to.
Yeah, I did have a lot of freedom. I had several public programs that sort of grounded what I needed to do, but they were also incredibly fun to do for the public. But otherwise, and aside from the dispatches, which I've told you about, otherwise, nobody was there saying, how did you spend today? What did you do now? And are you getting enough done? Which was great.
Yeah. Yeah, so to kind of maybe take a bird's eye view of craft and your poems, because you've written a lot of poems, you have quite a number of books out that I hope everyone will purchase. And I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about how you think about your writing from poem to poem, like on a poem level, and then how you move into that conception of a full book. How do you sort of move from maybe accumulating poems to then putting them together, talking to each other in a book or a collection in that way?
Well, I think maybe I do it differently in different projects. But working with In Old Sky, this book, almost every poem I started at the Grand Canyon is in the book, all except for one. Um, which isn't to say that I haven't written about darkness before, but I haven't written about darkness across and above the Grand Canyon in other poems. So I just took all of the, I think there are 33 poems in the book of varying sizes and shapes, and I took all of those and put them into the book. I think I said before, I'm interested in individual poems. I don't really write books. I don't think it's daunting to think about starting a book, honestly. And it's kind of too much for me to hold on to. So I'm interested in this one page or a page and a half or whatever, half a page that the poem is, and how can I make that be the most interesting it can be to me.
Mm.
I'm not thinking about anybody else at that point, because I don't actually know what anyone else wants from my poems. And so that's a kind of pressure I don't need to have. I'm not hard on me.
Mm.
I'm curious, and I will push and push on a poem over many drafts, sometimes many months, sometimes years, but I don't find that unpleasant. In fact, I like the process so much that I'm happy to keep going back in. So when finally there's the possibility of a book, or either on my end or someone else's end, I then I start figuring out how the poems go together.
Mm.
And usually it's the putting together of a book is on my end, right? I mean, I think that's how most people do it. But in this case, when the Grand Canyon Conservancy, which is the nonprofit partner, and the publishing arm has the publishing arm of Grand Canyon National Park, when they said, okay, we want a book, they were like, okay, we'll take your manuscript. And I didn't have it.
Mm.
So at that point, I really needed to figure out how I wanted the poems to flow. I had all the material, the poems were done, but the way that I do it, to just very nitty gritty, real, like actual way I do it, I have a big table in my studio and I clear it all off of all the things that have accumulated on it. And I start laying poems out and lining them up and walking around the table, pulling more in order, going back around and around and around, reading, moving them back, pulling, it's really a very hands-on looking and reading and seeing how things connect. When I'm done, which usually takes like 2 days, honestly, of like a lot of standing until my back hurts and my feet hurt and I'm no longer sure what, but when I think it's done, I take all those poems and put them in a binder in order, in their correct order. And I try to set it aside for as long as I can,
Mm.
then come back when it's out of my mind and read it and see how it flows and start rearranging again if I have to. But that's how I put together, I think, all of the books that I've done.
Mm. Yeah, I love that visual aspect of putting together. There's something about getting off of the screen, right, back to some sort of printed form where then you can really see, okay, not just the shapes of the poems, but how the maybe beginnings and endings are really working, and those threads that can kind of come through when you're looking at it. Almost like spinning the Scrabble board to get a better view of the words, right? Give yourself a new way to see.
Yeah, actually, just like that. And also, you're physically moving because the table is big. I'm
Mhm.
physically walking, to keep reading and moving around the table.
Yeah, I see a question in the chat, so we'll head there from Margaret, who says, Lauren, I love the way you wove ekphrastic poems into Took House to layer and deepen the emotional resonance of the book's narrative. Can you talk about how you approached this? Were these poems you had written previously or specifically for the book?
I think a thing I didn't say about when I'm putting together books, especially when they're thematically on a specific topic, typically, and this was certainly true in Took House, typically, I'm not that interested in um, the single subject, the single theme. I'm always interested in at the poem level or at the book level at complicating something. And so in Took House, there was a main storyline that I had poems for, a lot of poems, and a lot I left out of the book, but that storyline felt, I don't know, it's ironic because I was going to say it felt incomplete. It was very complete in a way, but it felt incomplete in that it didn't have anything else to like bounce off of, or create some kind of friction with, or
Mm.
something. And so I came back in, put in two other elements, poems about two other elements, so that there'd be um, some more substance to each of the different elements. So I had that main storyline. I had ekphrastic poems, I think all of which I had written at that point. And then I had poems about raptors, birds of prey, and those I had to write. But I, initially when I was starting to think about that, I was like, I just need some different thing, not just this one main concept. For this book, it's a little more specific, I think, to the darkness. But then again, maybe the other element is the Grand Canyon, and maybe the other element, which started to come in as I spent more of that month in a place of such pristine darkness, maybe that other third element, three is a good number for this, by the way, but maybe that third element is light pollution and or solitude. So there were different things that ended up showing up in these poems.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be such a simplification to say that this book is just about the darkness, right? Because I feel like the darkness of the sky acts almost as a prism for the speaker in some ways, right? There's almost a reflection or a refraction of the self in the depths, sort of the depths of the canyon, but also the depths of the sky that they're looking into. And that sense of wonder, I think, was so present. And yeah, I loved sort of the sort of emotional turns of the poems as we were moving through the book, and the way that it felt like there was such a presence there, such a reverence for the space, but also an acknowledgement of kind of the realities of the life that we're living now. And as you mentioned, light pollution, things like that coming in. Heat as well, I think, is another factor. Climate change, a big one. Yeah, thank you for that question, Margaret, as well. Um, Speaking of kind of the darkness, I was wondering if you could talk about the ways that maybe that element of the book worked, in terms of thinking about form with the poems. We often kind of think of the space around the poem as the white space, which feels at odds with darkness, right? But I think that there's kind of an organizing principle in the way that the poems are sort of threading together with the use of the sky, the dark, night, these different elements. And yeah, so could you talk about, those repetitions, the ways that we're sort of re-seeing again and again, the speaker interact with their surroundings, and maybe how the darkness influenced the poem's structure themselves?
Sure. And that idea of white space is really, it's really entertaining to think about that, right? As maybe in fact that space is dark matter in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
It has some mass, it's holding something, it's holding the words to wherever their place is on the page. Because I wrote so many different individual separate drafts of separate poems about the same subject. Each time I came up against the idea of darkness or the terminology of darkness, I kept tasking myself with finding new ways to describe it. And not just in language, like that by itself was not interesting enough to me just to find another way to say darkness, but another way to sense it. Another, like this darkness on this night is different from the darkness on the early morning that I got up to walk down to the bottom of the canyon, for example. And what is that darkness? How would I describe this? So, it would have been very easy to just endlessly talk about darkness or the skies, but they weren't all the same. And that was part of the gift and the responsibility of that time, was noticing, how are they different? How do I explore that difference? And that difference also changed based on, like, kind of based on my attitude or my mood or my um energy, or whatever it was. That darkness wasn't the same. So
Yeah, I like that in the way it sort of connects to these ideas of like repetition with variation, right? There's that re-seeing or re-experiencing, but there's always something a little different, and there's a new way that we're encountering that same image, which is really surprising.
Yeah, and I think that I think by rewriting, I just did an event in like an hour and a half away from here, and I had a small audience, and I was like, write the same subject a lot of times, just try it, because what happens is you go through your known ways, the ways that your whatever your mind or your heart wants to write them, and you're still writing them. You're still going back into it again and again. So now how are you going to do it? And that's where I think things really get interesting, is when you've already written it 3 times or 5 times. Now what? Now what angle, what direction, how are you going to enter the poem, or what is it going to look like on the page, or anything. And another way that I deal with how it's going to look on the page, and I think you kind of asked that, was I start playing around with shapes. I take, I mean, I am so not precious about my drafts. My drafts are, for me, they're not perfect. I mean, they're probably never perfect, but they're not perfect, certainly for the first round or second round, sometimes the 8th round or 20th round. That's not what I'm looking for. That's not interesting to me. What's interesting to me is being surprised over and over again. Like, what can I do? This poem, whatever this thing is I'm writing, is an engagement with myself. And I think maybe in a way that goes back to my childhood, where I was a creative little kid, and nobody cared. Nobody paid any attention to my creativity, which would have stopped someone else. But for me, it was just me. So I made for me. And I made until, whatever it was. I also had no art material, so so I was scratching things together, but I made the thing until I was happy with it. And so the creative space is a very safe space for me, and I'm really happy to be in it and playing around in it, and sort of mucking it up for a while and seeing what will show up. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, I think that revision process, right? That grace that we give ourselves when we go back to something, and that freedom that we give ourselves to, right? That kind of relief of the pressure of, messing it up, right? Sometimes the mess is how you get to the best of what the poem wants to be. Could you talk a little bit about how you approach revision, maybe in terms of this book, but maybe just in general? What does that look like for you? And, maybe a big question, but how do you know when a poem is at its kind of completed stage? I won't say finished, but as complete as you can get it.
Yeah, I think I have various, I guess they're techniques. I mean, my students probably would call them techniques that I use because I put them forward to classes, but I have a number of things I might look at in a poem, but I don't have a checklist. I don't have I don't have a written down anything. I just have like the idea in my mind that, um, maybe I want to look at, I don't know, I've talked about complicating things. Maybe I want to look at complicating line breaks here, or like, because I want to keep the poem very active and moving for a while before I settle on it, I'm throwing hurdles in my way and I come back to it. I'm saying, well, what if this? What if I ask a question in the middle? What if I take out the word darkness and describe it a different way? What if I write something really short, because this is going on social media and people don't have a big attention span? So can I take this poem that's taking up a page and shrink it down? Like, I go in with usually 1 or 2 things, and I'm just like, what if I try this? I mean, it's a series of what ifs, honestly. And I wait and see what will happen. Sometimes I smush poems together. I change the shape. A lot of times I will change the shape of the poem. I write with line breaks. I know some people write
Mm.
in like a prose block. I don't do that unless I intend for it to be a prose block. So I write sort of thinking, I guess, sort of not thinking, not
Mm.
consciously thinking about where I want the line to end. And one technique that works really well for me is to change that from where I thought I wanted the lines, plural, the whole thing to end.
Mm.
So I might take it and make it a very narrow column all of a sudden, not necessarily because I want to keep it that way, but because I
Mm.
want to see it a different way. So I play around with line breaks, line lengths a lot. I also change the titles if I come back to something and I can't figure out something about it, then I'll give it a new title.
Mm.
And that's intriguing to me. So earlier today, I was looking back over some earlier versions of some of these poems to see, well, how many times did I go over the poems? And it varied from, 4 to 25.
Mm.
And then I went over the whole manuscript 5 or 6 times too. But yeah, I'm looking to shift things. One of the poems had like 8 titles. It was crazy. It's just nuts. And you asked another question that I wanted to answer, and I think I've forgotten it. I think it was the last one in your series.
Oh yeah. Oh goodness, maybe it'll come back to me. Vision, how you approach it. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe someone in the audience will send it our way too. Um, but yeah, I think thinking about kind of exploding the poems or, getting in there, making it messy, those what ifs, right? The possibility that's sort of held in that question, right? What if? Oh, there we go. Sandra, thank you. How do you know when the poem is complete?
Yeah. Okay. How do you know when the poem is complete? Well, so this goes back to the question of time and letting things, the word that I like to use is letting things marinate, letting the poem marinate. So, and that means I've come back and, it's totally fine with me if this makes no sense to anyone else but me. But if it makes sense to someone and they want to do it, I think it's been so rich and interesting to me to do this. So if I come in, write a draft, let's say I've written a draft for a poem and I just set it aside. Life goes on. I maybe write something else. Or maybe life just keeps me busy elsewhere. I come back to the poem. I'm not looking to finish it. I'm looking to add something else in there, whatever that is. I'm looking to just play around with it. No, I no longer like it in the present tense. I'm going to put it in the past tense. I don't know, whatever, do something to it. Shift it a little, throw something in there, and then set it aside again. And so there's a lot of time built into that process, a lot of slow accrual of varying shiftings of the poem. And lest you think that nothing's getting done over here, I'm doing that with a bunch of, like when I'm able to write, I'm doing that with a number of poems out at a time, at a sitting, usually. So when I can come back to a poem and like it and not have anything I want to do to it, like it when I read it aloud, then I could say it's done. But there's one other part that goes along with it for me, and that is when something in the poem makes me feel, usually I say makes me feel giddy, like and it's maybe some language or some perspective, something that's both real and true and surprising to me. And it might be how 4 words are put together, or it might be, it might be me describing something terrible, but lousy, traumatic, whatever, but describing it in a way that is so exhilarating to myself. Because keep in mind, I'm the whole audience at this point. And So it's when there's something really sort of special and makes me deeply engaged with the work as though it is not my own.
Mm.
And I would say when those two things happen together, then I think it's done.
Yeah, that's so key, right? Engaging with your own work as though it's not yours. I think that's so difficult to do, but I think that time is one of the only things that allows that to be possible. It's why it's so hard to teach revision in short-term classes because there's just not enough time to let things sit, right? I love you use marinate. I think that's a great way to put it, right? You don't have to think about it. You can live life, you can write other things, and then when you go back, something has shifted, right? Coming back with a new perspective, new ideas.
A lot has shifted. First of all, it's not so precious anymore. It's not like you just wrote it or just rewrote it that day or the day before. Also, it might be a different season, might be a different time of day. The news will have impacted, or your community or your household, or, you know, any number of things will have shifted, and you come as a different person to the same
Mm.
poem.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna come back to this chat for that quote too, because I think that's a beautiful way to put it. Lori has a question in the chat. How do you manage working on several poems at one time? As ideas come flooding in, do you stash generative ideas or poems and work on them simultaneously?
What an interesting question. Usually I'm working on revisions, I should say, to several poems. I don't write a number of poems at once. Um, I recently saw a post by someone who said they had written 8 poems in one day, and that's not me. That's not how I work. And it was kind of shocking, but I can work. Like I can look at one poem and revise it, and I'm not trying to revise it to be done. So
Mm.
I'm really trying to revise it a little, and maybe because almost everything I do is intuitive and not intentional, maybe what I'm doing is giving it a sort of I'm like a pass. I don't know if that makes sense, a pass over it, but not a deep dive into it.
Mm.
So I'm sort of passing across it, reading it aloud, seeing what jumps out is not working to me, fixing that, introducing something else, and not obsessing about whether that something else works or not, but just, look, I've moved that along. Okay, that's good. And then picking another poem, ideally about like from a totally different time, about a different subject, which then gives these 3 poems or 5 poems that I might manage to work on some connective tissue,
Mm.
something that I'm looking at. Oh, I did this here. I definitely want to do it here, or I definitely don't want to do it here. Look, I've got this construction for how I'm describing things, or I'm always only seeing things. How do I now also touch? How do I now also smell? Like,
Mm.
how do I come at this in a different way? Oh, I'm backing into this poem. How do I come at it? Very straightforward declarative sentences. So in a way, working on multiple poems at once gives me a way to notice not just what I thought I was noticing, but to notice the craft of what I'm doing over and over.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's really sort of opens up something, right? The way you approach different poems can teach you about those different poems, and you can go back to other poems having learned from your previous poems too. Um, that constant kind of learning, teaching, reworking cycle that can make revision fun. I know it's not everyone's favorite thing to do, to go back to their work, but I think it's such an expansive time for not just the poems, but for us as artists and writers, and kind of expanding our craft and our ways of seeing on the page too.
I tell my students, and I believe it firmly, that revision is where the magic happens.
Mm.
Other people believe the opposite, that first draft is where the magic happens. For me, it's whatever I'm doing in that whole process, sometimes lengthy, sometimes less so, of um of opening out the poem that I initially thought I was writing. And I'm usually not writing a poem where I know where I'm going.
Mm.
Not, it's not like, oh, I want to write a poem about X. That's not how I typically do it. I just want to write. I want to
Mm.
take whatever it is I'm thinking about or holding. Like I've written a lot about my father in a number of ways, but about his childhood. But I've also written a lot about his dipping into dementia. And I, there it's exhilarating to me to take a poem and turn it inside out and use it as a way to better understand whatever I end up writing about.
Mm. Yeah, that's so important too. And yeah, I do think revision is the space of possibility for poems. And I think there's often some fear that we'll lose whatever magic that first draft has, right? That first spark that often gets people to the page. Then when revision comes, they're like, well, what if I lose that, right? But instead, what do you gain in revision? So much more comes into the poem at that stage too. Right, Sandra has a question in the chat. Do you have a critique group or readers at some point in your process?
I don't have a critique group. I have a reader who I'm married to. Um, he he's not a poet. He's sometimes dabbles in prose writing, story fiction writing, but he's very logical in his thinking. He catches me on continuity and on mixed metaphors, and he sometimes gives me suggestions that drive me nuts. And I kind of rail against them, and sometimes I do them. He likes more commas than I do in my poems. He's very determined that, this is a separate clause, it needs a comma. And sometimes I don't want that. I want to complicate, I want to disrupt that thought in that way. But he is a very, very good reader of my writing because he comes to it open-minded, and he comes to it not as a poet. So, he comes to it with wanting to understand it, wanting to know what it is I'm saying.
I think we all need someone who's not a poet to look at our work sometimes, because again, it's those ways of kind of re-seeing our work and coming to it from a different perspective. And even those questions or those suggestions, those ideas that might drive us nuts, like, that's not what I want to do, then it sort of reinforces what we want to do on the page. And it can work to help us get the poem in a better place, even if it's not necessarily where they're thinking we should go with it.
Absolutely. I mean, then you're arguing for your own decision, and your own decision becomes even more valid than when you first did it. And I will say there's something else that I have him do that I highly recommend. So I will print out the poem when I think it's done and give it to him, and then try to ignore him as he's working on it, which is difficult. But when he's done and we've gone back and forth over certain lines or whatever, I will ask him to read the poem to me. He's never heard me read it, so I will ask him to read the poem aloud to me. And I'll sit there with a pen and paper and make notes of what I'm hearing that feels a little strange to me, that I might not like whatever it is, it's too wordy here, or this word showed up twice and I don't like it like that, or this sound. And that's another way, that's sort of another way for me to work on revision, is by hearing what someone else takes from the page.
Yeah.
Without
Yeah, I think that audio component is so important. You mentioned earlier reading your poems out loud as well, as part of your process. And I think there is something about hearing your work from someone else, hearing the way that they maybe stress the lines, or, oh, it seems like they're stressing that word in the middle of the line. Maybe that's the line break, right? There's just different things, or maybe that's a point to go back to because something's not quite working there. Yeah, I think that's great advice, and always recommend hearing your work out loud in some way, shape, or form, whether it's you or someone else. But yeah, someone else is just very eye-opening. It's another great step in the process. Right. I did want to talk a little bit about form, because we have a lot of different shapes in this book. Lots of longer lines. We have some of those shorter kind of interstitial poems that come in. And then there's a couple, more justified, maybe almost prose-like poems. And then, of course, the kind of collective, almost cento from the responses at the Grand Canyon itself. So first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about form kind of in general, how you approached it for this book in particular, and maybe thinking about the forms on the page and how you see them connecting to the form that you were observing, right? The Grand Canyon and the sky, and in any sort of interplay between those.
Yeah, so the forms on the page are very specific to each individual poem. Again, because I'm working in the individual poem. So ultimately the forms, when I'm laying the book out, that's another thing. When I'm laying the manuscript out, that's another thing I'm looking at, is how do the forms match up, or, do I want poems that all look like this together? And usually my answer is no. I actually like a variety of forms, and I won't say I never will do X or Y, because as soon as I say it, then I'm sure I'm going to do it. But for me, I'm looking at the form that best matches the poem that I'm writing, whatever it is. And like the second poem that I read you, that little poem, I think it was one of the dispatches, because at some point I was like, oh, I need short dispatches for the social media. So what can I contain in here? And the canyon itself clearly entered the poems in a variety of ways. I mean, halfway through my month at the canyon, I traveled down to the bottom to Phantom Ranch, which and then back up a couple days later. Really, I don't know if anyone here has done that, but it's an intense hike down, and it's an intense hike up. And as they say, you're not, it's not like any other hike you go on. You're not going up a little, down a little. You're going the one direction you're going for many, many hours. And so there's that verticality to the canyon that I think enters a lot of the poems. And then there's this expansiveness of sky that is the different version of how I'm seeing. So the canyon in all ways, both thematically and structurally, and negative space, is throughout the poems.
Yeah, I love the way that I'm just kind of flipping through the book, which is full of beautiful photos as well. But I love the way the poems sort of ebb and flow. There's a kind of meandering nature to the forms as we move through, and I'm kind of glancing for that verticality, which is so present here in the poems themselves. And I think, yeah, I love that kind of interplay between the form and some of the content too, in ways that's not right, kind of screaming at you from the surface. You're sort of, oh, okay, I see maybe how the presence of the space is coming into the poems in different ways. Could you talk a little bit about the collective poem, Look Up, Look Out, Look Infinite, which I loved. And I was thinking of it as sort of like a cento, right? Kind of pulling these lines from the visitors. And yeah, just what was your process with that one like? How did it maybe differ from your typical writing process? And how did you kind of put all these lines together?
Absolutely. The poem itself is built entirely from crowdsourced bits of information from visitors to the canyon over probably about a 2-week or 2.5-week period. I put prompts of statements, prompts, uh, fairly simple, explained the project a little bit in all the visitor centers I could. I think they were in maybe 5 visitor centers, Grand Canyon Conservancy centers, and a box and some cards, and just invited people to respond to these. I gathered all those hundreds of responses and brought them back to my apartment in the middle of the day, because that's a good time to be inside, not out at the canyon. And I didn't know how I was going to put them together, but I knew that I wanted only to use those words. And I wanted to try to use some words from each of the cards if I possibly could. So I gathered all that information and started moving things around. It was like a giant collage curation ordering project. And what I ended up with was an 8-part poem that I built. I built it into 8 parts based on the phases of the moon. That was how I divided the material. And I think, and so none of the words are mine. They're all from visitors to the canyon. But this project, doing this, gave me the idea to do it around my state. So it's become a big part of my Poet Laureate project is to do like community sourced poems. I'm in there because I put this together, but I didn't write this. And it gives me a new way to see whatever it is I'm seeing, in this case, darkness or the canyon, or how people feel about night. So maybe I'll just read one of the little
Yeah, that
sections.
would be great.
Okay, this one is, so it's in 8 parts, and this is maybe the 4th or 5th. It's waning gibbous. Sunset rests to be reborn better tomorrow. Red, pink, blue, purple, the sky melts like a wet painting in light rain. Nothing more delicious than a landscape with crevices. Golden hour, light years. Take dark, add stars, make night. Filling our rooms from the terror monster under the bed. Tonight I am one, tonight happy. The night allows us to go towards the meeting place, the illumination from very far.
Ugh, I loved the poem and seeing some repetitions, right? But they're organic, right? People are noticing the same things, but coming at them in different ways. And it just felt like a really kind of wonderful culmination of your time there, but also this kind of emphasis on how we engage with the world around us. And when we're all seeing through different eyes, right? What do we take from that?
Yeah, well, and I think also because as I said, I was working so much in the space of myself that this was entirely outward focused. This was entirely let me take myself out of here. Let me hear from you. You tell me how you feel about this. And, the answers came in varying languages and from people. I mean, visitors to the Grand Canyon come from everywhere, from all over the world. And so totally different perspectives. I mean, it was a wonderful way to be very audience based or outward focused.
Yeah, I love that. I sadly just glanced at the clock and we're right at our end time for the chat. But I did want to get in our last question. I know we've gotten so much great writing advice, revision advice, but what's your go-to maybe craft advice, maybe something that you think about when you're approaching a poem or something that you teach. What can you share with us this evening?
I know we've talked about it, but I think it's worth repeating: patience,
Mm.
time. I mean, I feel like that's the key to everything. But I think maybe also don't let your work be precious. Like for as long as you can, maybe the whole time, don't make it be precious. Like make it be something you can play around with. If you see some nifty technique then in a poem that you've read and read a lot, but if you've seen some nifty technique, try that little idea in your poem. Look, somebody did this little thing. I can figure out how to do something like that in this poem, even if I can't picture how that's going to work. So I think maybe that pairing of patience and then not making it precious, which
Mm.
another way to say that is probably play. I think that's
Yeah.
my, yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's a perfect place to end. I know the chats always end far sooner than I would like them to. We could talk for hours. Thank you, everyone, for spending your evening with us. Thank you, Lauren, for sharing your time, your wisdom, your words. And please, everyone, pick up a copy of the book. You will not regret it. It is so beautiful. And Lauren, I'm so glad we got to chat again, too.
Thank you, Emily, for your great questions. Thank you, everybody, for being here.